Welcome to Sinister Stories, where the shadows hold more than just secrets. If you're a fan of the dark and the twisted, you're in the right place. Tonight, we dive into a tale that will send chills down your spine. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss a single spine-tingling story. When Travis applied for the night shift job at the Clover Hill Landfill, he figured it would be simple. The ad was vague, just sorting trash and operating equipment. But it paid well, and he desperately needed the money after his hours at the hardware store were cut. The manager, an older man named Carl, didn't sugarcoat the reality of the job during Travis's interview. "It's not glamorous, kid. Nights can feel different around here," Carl said, his voice trailing off as he slid a list of rules across the desk. Rules? For a landfill? Travis stifled a laugh, but Carl's expression was dead serious. Do not turn on any lights between 2:33 a.m. and 2:40 a.m. If you hear music, locate the source immediately and turn it off. Do not let the music play for more than 1 minute. If you see your reflection in any discarded mirrors, walk away. Do not look back. If you notice any dolls, leave them alone. Do not pick them up or move them. At 3:15 a.m., stop everything you're doing and stay in the break room for 10 minutes. No matter what you hear, do not leave. Travis's laugh faded. Is this some kind of joke? Carl leaned in close, his eyes cold. Break the rules and you won't make it through the night. Got it? Travis nodded, unsure if Carl was messing with him or just plain crazy. The first night at the landfill was quiet, at least for the first few hours. Travis spent most of his time sorting through mountains of trash and using a bulldozer to clear space for the next day's deliveries. The air was thick with the stench of rotting garbage, but he adjusted quickly, grateful for the solitude. By 1:30 a.m., he was exhausted. He leaned against the bulldozer, taking a break, when he noticed something odd. A doll, half buried in a pile of trash. Its porcelain face was cracked, and one glass eye dangled loosely from its socket. He felt a chill but shrugged it off. Trash is trash, he thought, turning back to his work. Then he heard it. A faint melody drifted through the night, the sound of a piano playing an old, haunting tune. It seemed to come from deeper in the landfill, where the older piles of debris loomed like forgotten mountains. Travis froze, Carl's warning echoing in his mind. If you hear music, locate the source immediately and turn it off. Gripping his flashlight, Travis followed the sound, weaving through stacks of broken furniture, discarded appliances, and twisted metal. The music grew louder, clearer. He rounded a corner and spotted an old upright piano, its keys moving on their own, as if invisible hands were playing. "Hell no," Travis whispered, his heart pounding. He approached cautiously, sweat beading on his forehead. The melody shifted, becoming slower and more dissonant. The closer he got, the harder it was to move, like the air itself was pressing against him. Finally, he reached out and slammed the lid over the keys. The music stopped. For a moment, the landfill was silent again, save for the distant rustle of wind through the trash. Travis exhaled shakily and turned to head back to his station. That's when he saw them. Dolls. Dozens of them. They peeked out from piles of garbage, their eyes glinting in the moonlight. Some were missing limbs, others had faces worn smooth by time, but they all seemed to be looking at him. His legs felt like lead as he backed away, careful not to touch any of them. He reminded himself of the rules. Do not pick them up or move them. When he finally reached the bulldozer, he jumped in and locked the doors. His hands trembled as he checked the time. 3:12 a.m. He needed to get to the break room. The break room was a small, dingy trailer on the edge of the landfill. Travis bolted inside and locked the door behind him. He collapsed into a chair, his breath coming in shallow gasps. At exactly 3:15 a.m., the sounds began. Soft footsteps circled the trailer, slow and deliberate. Then came the scratching, a long, drawn-out scrape against the metal walls. Travis gripped the edge of the table, fighting the urge to look out the window. The rules were clear. No matter what you hear, do not leave. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like nails dragging across a chalkboard. It was joined by whispers, faint and unintelligible, but unmistakably close. Travis squeezed his eyes shut and counted the seconds. At 3:25 a.m., the noises stopped. He opened his eyes, his pulse still racing. The landfill was silent again. But as he stepped outside, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The dolls were gone. Travis's shift the next night began as usual, or at least as usual as things could get in a landfill that seemed alive after dark. He clocked in, grabbed his gear, and walked to his station. The memory of the previous night, the piano, the dolls, the scratching on the trailer, hung heavy in his mind, but he pushed it aside. "It's just the job," he muttered to himself. "Get in, follow the rules, and get out." The first few hours passed uneventfully. He used the bulldozer to shift massive heaps of debris and sorted through trash for hazardous materials. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he worked, its narrow cone of light the only thing separating him from the sprawling void of garbage. But as the clock neared 1 a.m., Travis started to feel it again, that oppressive, watchful presence. He glanced around, scanning the heaps of trash. The landfill was eerily still, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving just out of sight. That's when he saw the first doll. It was perched atop a stack of old tires, its tiny head cocked to one side. This one wasn't like the others he'd seen before. Its face was pristine, its glass eyes clear and lifelike. For a moment, Travis thought it was just a normal toy. Then it blinked. He stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. The doll didn't move again, but its gaze followed him as he backed away. "Stay calm," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Just leave it alone." The rule was simple. Do not pick them up or move them. He turned and walked away, his heart pounding in his chest. But the further he got from the doll, the more he noticed others. They were scattered across the landfill, peeking out from under piles of garbage, dangling from broken furniture, and sitting upright in the dirt. By the time he reached the bulldozer, there were at least 20 of them, all positioned as if watching his every move. The night stretched on, and Travis tried to focus on his work, but the dolls were always there, always watching. It didn't matter where he went. They seemed to shift positions when he wasn't looking. One moment a doll would be half buried in a pile of old newspapers. The next it would be sitting on a nearby crate, its lifeless face turned toward him. Around 2:30 a.m., Travis parked the bulldozer and took a break. He leaned against the machine, wiping sweat from his brow. The air was unnervingly still, the usual sounds of rustling trash and distant animal calls absent. Then, without warning, the piano started again. The haunting melody echoed through the landfill, each note sending a shiver down his spine. He checked his watch. 2:33 a.m. Carl's warning flashed through his mind. Do not turn on any lights between 2:33 a.m. and 2:40 a.m. Travis's hand hovered over the bulldozer's headlight switch. He was tempted to break the rule, to flood the landfill with light and banish whatever was out there, but he couldn't risk it. Instead, he grabbed his flashlight and began walking toward the sound. The piano was in the same spot as before, half buried in a pile of trash. Its keys moved on their own, the melody growing louder and more discordant as he approached. Travis clenched his teeth and slammed the lid over the keys. The music stopped abruptly, the silence deafening. He turned to leave, but something caught his eye. A mirror. It was propped against a rusted filing cabinet, its surface cracked and grimy. At first, he saw nothing unusual. But as he moved closer, the reflection began to change. His own image faded, replaced by something else, something impossible. The mirror showed the landfill as it truly was, alive with movement. Shadows flitted between piles of trash, their shapes too distorted to be human. The dolls weren't just sitting still, they were crawling, running, and gathering in clusters, their tiny limbs jerking unnaturally. And then, in the center of the reflection, Travis saw himself. But it wasn't him. Not exactly. The figure in the mirror had his face, but its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. It raised a hand, waving mockingly. Travis stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. The mirror began to vibrate, a low hum emanating from its frame. Without thinking, he turned and ran. By the time he reached the break room, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely unlock the door. He bolted inside and collapsed into a chair, checking the time. 3:14 a.m. He'd made it just in time. At 3:15 a.m., the noises started again. Footsteps, scratching, whispers. This time they were louder, more insistent. Something banged on the door, hard enough to make the whole trailer shake. Travis sat frozen, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges of the table. He forced himself to stay put, to follow the rules. When the noises finally stopped at 3:25 a.m., he felt a brief moment of relief. But as he stepped outside, his heart sank. The dolls were back, and they weren't alone. Shadows moved among them, darting between piles of trash, and in the distance, the piano started to play again. Travis tightened his grip on the flashlight, its beam trembling as he scanned the landfill. The dolls were everywhere now, scattered across the mounds of garbage, their eyes glinting like tiny glass predators in the dark. But it wasn't just the dolls that unnerved him. It was the shadows. At first, he thought they were tricks of the dim light, the interplay of his flashlight and the chaotic shapes of the landfill. But these shadows moved with purpose. They darted between piles of trash, slinking closer with each pass. A chill crept down his spine as he realized they were circling him. "Stay calm," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. He remembered the rules. If shadows follow you, do not look directly at them. Keep moving and stay within the light. With measured steps, he backed toward the bulldozer, keeping the flashlight trained on the ground. His breath fogged the air in quick, shallow bursts. The piano's eerie tune echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Reaching the bulldozer, Travis climbed into the cab and slammed the door shut. The vehicle felt like a fragile sanctuary, its metal shell barely enough to shield him from whatever was out there. The shadows swirled around the machine, their movements erratic and disjointed. He avoided looking at them directly, focusing instead on the control panel. He fired up the bulldozer, the engine roaring to life. The sound seemed to disrupt the shadows, making them retreat slightly. Encouraged, Travis pushed the throttle forward, the massive machine lurching ahead. As he worked to clear a section of the landfill, he kept one eye on the piles of trash. The shadows stayed at a distance, but the dolls were everywhere. Some sat motionless, their lifeless faces tilted upward as if watching the sky. Others moved in short, jerky bursts, crawling across the debris like grotesque insects. One doll, a porcelain figure with golden curls and a frilly dress, climbed onto the bulldozer's blade. It stared at him through the windshield, its head tilting slowly to one side. Travis froze, his hands gripping the controls. The doll raised one tiny hand and waved. "Nope," he muttered, slamming the blade downward. The doll disappeared beneath the garbage, but when he raised the blade again, it was gone. By 4 a.m., the shadows had grown bolder. They no longer stayed at the edges of the light, but began creeping closer, their dark forms flickering in and out of sight. Travis parked the bulldozer and stepped out cautiously, keeping the flashlight in front of him. He needed to finish sorting the hazardous materials before his shift ended, but every step felt like walking through a minefield. As he approached a pile of old electronics, he noticed something strange. An antique radio sat atop the heap, its wooden frame warped and cracked. It shouldn't have worked, but it crackled to life as he drew near. A distorted voice spilled out, garbled and faint. "Leave! Now!" Travis swallowed hard, his throat dry. The voice repeated the message, each word drawn out and guttural. He didn't need to be told twice. He turned to leave, but as he did, the radio blared a high-pitched shriek. Behind him, the shadows surged forward. Travis broke into a run, his boots crunching against the debris-strewn ground. He didn't dare look back, but he could hear them, whispering, hissing, and rustling. The dolls seemed to come alive as he passed, their heads swiveling to follow his movements. His flashlight began to flicker, its beam dimming. "Not now," he muttered, shaking it violently. The light steadied for a moment before flickering again. He reached the break room trailer just as the flashlight gave out completely. Slamming the door behind him, he leaned against it, gasping for air. The whispers continued outside, growing louder and more insistent. Something scratched at the door, long, deliberate strokes that sent shivers down his spine. Travis glanced at the clock. 4:45 a.m. He just had to survive until dawn. As the minutes dragged on, the noises outside grew more chaotic. The piano music had returned, its discordant melody mingling with the whispers and scratches. Travis grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, reinforcing the barrier. He then turned his attention to the small window on the far wall. Pulling the blinds aside, he peeked out. What he saw made his blood run cold. The shadows had coalesced into a single massive form. It towered over the landfill, its amorphous shape shifting and writhing. The dolls were gathered at its base, their tiny bodies moving in unison like a grotesque congregation. The shadow entity turned toward the trailer, its formless mass pulsing with dark energy. Travis backed away from the window, his mind racing. He checked the clock again. 4:57 a.m. 3 more minutes. The trailer began to shake violently, the door rattling on its hinges. A deep, guttural roar filled the air, drowning out the piano and whispers. Travis pressed himself into a corner, clutching the useless flashlight like a weapon. He closed his eyes, praying for the first rays of sunlight to break through the darkness. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The trailer fell silent. Travis opened his eyes cautiously. The clock read 5 a.m. Peeking out the window, he saw the first hints of dawn breaking over the horizon. The shadow entity was gone, and the dolls were once again lifeless, scattered across the landfill like ordinary trash. For now, the nightmare was over. The sunlight filtered through the gray haze that perpetually hung over the landfill, casting a muted glow over the chaotic landscape. Travis emerged from the trailer cautiously, his legs shaky and his mind racing to process the night's events. The shadows were gone, and the landfill appeared normal again, or as normal as a sprawling wasteland of trash could ever be. He had made it through the night, but the job was starting to take its toll. Every shift seemed to push the boundaries of reality further, leaving him questioning his own sanity. As he walked toward the equipment shed, he noticed something unusual. A small black notebook lay on the ground near the bulldozer. It hadn't been there before. Travis hesitated before picking it up. The cover was blank, and the pages inside were filled with handwritten notes in a spidery script. The first page read, "To survive the landfill, remember this. The rules keep you safe, but they won't protect you forever. The shadows are hungry and they learn. Each night will be harder than the last." Travis's stomach churned as he flipped through the notebook. The entries detailed strange encounters similar to his own, moving dolls, ominous shadows, and objects coming to life. But they also mentioned things he hadn't yet experienced: glowing eyes in the darkness, voices calling his name, and trash piles shifting to block escape routes. The final page had one sentence scrawled across it in bold, jagged letters: "Do not trust the reflections." He closed the notebook, his hands trembling. Whoever had written this had been in his position, but there was no indication of what had happened to them. The thought sent a fresh wave of unease through him. The day passed in a blur of exhaustion and anxiety. Travis tried to get some rest, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dolls, the shadows, and the massive entity that had formed in the night. By the time his next shift rolled around, he was running on fumes. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Travis returned to the landfill. The familiar hum of the machinery greeted him, but it did little to calm his nerves. He decided to keep the notebook with him, slipping it into the pocket of his work jacket. The first few hours of the shift were uneventful. Travis focused on sorting the trash, doing his best to keep his mind occupied. But as midnight approached, the air grew heavy, and the landfill seemed to come alive once more. It started with the mirrors. Travis noticed them scattered across the piles of debris, shards of glass glinting in the moonlight. He hadn't seen so many during his previous shifts, and their sudden appearance felt deliberate. The rules echoed in his mind. Do not look directly into mirrors after midnight. If you see your reflection move, leave immediately. Despite his better judgment, curiosity got the better of him. He glanced at one of the mirrors, a cracked oval frame buried halfway in a pile of rotting furniture. His reflection stared back, its features distorted by the broken glass. At first, it seemed normal enough, but then it blinked. Travis hadn't blinked. He stumbled back, his heart racing. The reflection twisted into a grotesque parody of himself, its mouth stretching into an unnaturally wide grin. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. Travis turned and ran, the notebook bouncing against his side as he fled. He didn't stop until he reached the bulldozer, climbing into the cab and locking the door behind him. The mirrors were everywhere now, their cracked surfaces reflecting warped images of the landfill. He tried to avoid looking at them, but it was impossible to ignore the whispers. "Travis." The voice was soft but insistent, calling his name over and over. It seemed to come from all directions, echoing off the mounds of garbage. He gritted his teeth, gripping the bulldozer's controls tightly. The machine roared to life and he began clearing the area, focusing on the task at hand. But the landfill had other plans. The ground trembled beneath the bulldozer, the trash shifting like waves on a turbulent sea. Travis struggled to keep the machine steady as piles of debris collapsed and reformed around him. Suddenly, the piano music returned, its haunting melody filling the air. This time it was closer, the notes resonating with an almost tangible weight. Travis spotted the piano at the top of a nearby trash mound, its once elegant frame now battered and stained. A figure sat at the keys, its form shrouded in shadow. The music grew louder, more frantic, as the figure played with unnatural speed. The dolls began to move, converging on the bulldozer from all directions. Their tiny hands clawed at the machine, their glassy eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. Panic surged through Travis as he realized the bulldozer wouldn't protect him. He had to get out of the landfill, and fast. Abandoning the bulldozer, he sprinted toward the exit, weaving through the piles of trash. The dolls pursued him relentlessly, their movements jerky but unnervingly fast. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a deafening cacophony. "Travis! Stay with us. You can't leave." The mirrors flashed in his peripheral vision, their twisted reflections taunting him. He refused to look, focusing instead on the fence in the distance. Finally, he reached the gate, fumbling with the lock in his haste. The dolls were closing in, their tiny feet pattering against the ground. With a desperate shove, he pushed the gate open and stumbled through. The moment he crossed the threshold, the noises stopped. He turned to look back, but the landfill was dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. Travis staggered to his car, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He clutched the notebook tightly, its weight a grim reminder of what he had just endured. The night was over, but he knew the worst was yet to come. The next evening, Travis sat in his car, staring at the looming silhouette of the landfill. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, the events of the previous night replaying in his mind. He considered driving away, quitting the job, and never looking back. But something compelled him to stay. Perhaps it was a mix of curiosity and desperation. He needed the money, yes, but he also needed answers. The notebook lay open on the passenger seat. Travis had spent hours poring over its contents, searching for anything that might help him survive what felt like an inevitable escalation. The final entry echoed in his thoughts. Do not trust the reflections. He took a deep breath, grabbed the notebook, and stepped out of the car. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, the familiar foul odor of the landfill. As he walked toward the trailer, the ground beneath his boots felt different, softer, as if it was shifting ever so slightly. The shift began as usual, with Travis sorting trash and using the bulldozer to clear space for the next day's load. The first few hours passed uneventfully, but as midnight approached, the air grew colder, and the landfill seemed to come alive once more. The mirrors returned, scattered across the trash piles like ominous beacons. Travis avoided looking at them, keeping his focus on the task at hand. But then he heard it, the piano. This time, the music was slower, almost mournful, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. He climbed out of the bulldozer and scanned the area, his heart pounding. The piano was nowhere in sight, but the melody persisted, weaving through the air like a ghostly thread. The dolls appeared next, emerging from the trash in droves. Their movements were more deliberate now, as if they had a purpose. They surrounded him, their tiny faces turned upward, unblinking. Travis backed away, his foot brushing against something solid. He looked down and saw a mirror, its surface cracked and streaked with grime. Against his better judgment, he glanced at his reflection. It smiled. Travis froze as the reflection began to change. Its features twisted and contorted, becoming something monstrous. The grin widened unnaturally, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice low and guttural. He stumbled back, kicking the mirror aside. The dolls moved closer, their tiny hands reaching for him. Travis ran, dodging between the piles of trash. The piano music grew louder, its mournful tune shifting into a frenzied cacophony. He reached the trailer and slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. But the safety was short-lived. The lights flickered, and the temperature plummeted. The trailer groaned as if under immense pressure, and the walls began to warp. A loud crash echoed outside, followed by the sound of something massive moving through the landfill. Travis peeked out the window and saw the trash shifting, rising into a towering form. The entity from the night before had returned, its glowing eyes fixed on the trailer. The notebook in Travis's hand seemed to vibrate, drawing his attention. He opened it to the last page, where new words had appeared. "It feeds on fear. Face it, or it will never stop." Travis's breath caught in his throat. Face it. How could he face something so massive, so incomprehensibly evil? But he didn't have a choice. The trailer creaked and buckled as the entity loomed closer, its shadow enveloping everything. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Travis stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wall, and the stench of decay was overpowering. The entity paused as if surprised by his defiance. "I'm not afraid of you," Travis shouted, his voice shaking but determined. The entity's glowing eyes narrowed, and the shadows around it writhed like living things. The piano music reached a deafening crescendo, and the ground shook violently. Travis held his ground, clutching the notebook like a lifeline. "I won't let you control me." The entity let out a bone-chilling roar, its form collapsing in on itself. The shadows dissipated, and the landfill fell silent. For a moment, everything was still. Then the mirrors shattered, their shards scattering like fallen stars. The dolls froze, their glassy eyes losing their eerie glint. The piano music faded into nothingness, leaving only the sound of Travis's ragged breathing. He sank to his knees, the weight of the ordeal finally catching up to him. As dawn broke, the landfill seemed almost peaceful. The chaos of the night was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. Travis knew he couldn't stay. Whatever had haunted the landfill would return, and he couldn't face it again. He left the notebook on the trailer's desk, a warning for whoever came after him. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing among the trash watching him leave. But when he looked again, it was gone. The landfill still stands, its secrets buried beneath mountains of waste. And somewhere in the shadows, the entity waits, hungry for its next victim.